Welcome back to the third video in the Standard Costing IME 239 series. In the previous two videos, we talked about an introduction to standard costs, material costs, and labor costs. This video will be on overhead costs, specifically variable and fixed overhead costs. So an overhead cost is essentially any cost in a facility that isn't material or labor. That includes indirect labor, indirect materials, machines, utilities, quality control, facility rent, insurance, a whole list of items. The overhead costs are usually predetermined in a budget at the beginning of the year of application. So at the beginning of 2017, a group of management folks would get together and create a budget for 2017. The overhead costs are composed of fixed and variable overhead. Variable overhead are costs that grow as the number of units produced grow. And you can see the chart there on the right. It has a positive slope. So these are things like indirect materials. If you are producing more units, you're going to be using up more indirect materials. Fixed overhead costs are costs that generally remain the same as the number of units produced increases. Those are costs like facility rent, insurance, utilities even. Utilities are a little bit tricky. Most people consider them fixed overhead because they vary so little, month by month or quarter by quarter, that they generally are fixed. So we'll start first with variable manufacturing overhead costs. And those are the costs incurred, again, like I said, as production increases. So the increased costs as production increases. So it's a cost per unit that remains the same within a relevant range. Usually this value is calculated or set by management, and that's through a budget, as I said at the beginning of the year. Typically, a budget will say, we have this large, thousands of dollars, large amount of money that goes towards variable overhead and a large amount of money that we're budgeting towards fixed overhead. And then those pockets of money can be distributed or allocated as is seen fit by the company. So for example, if one unit takes 2 hours of labor to produce, then we would allocate 2 hours of this variable manufacturing overhead to every unit that we produce. And that's just to allocate or allow all units to absorb some of the overhead cost. Some examples of variable overhead costs are consumed manufacturing supplies and equipment maintenance costs. So the way that you would calculate variable overhead costs is by looking at two standards. The first is the standard unit of measurement. That can be standard labor hours, standard machine hours. It's typically one of those two. And the second is the standard variable overhead rate. And so as I said, that is generally a large quantity from the budget, thousands of dollars, that is set aside for variable overhead. And then when there is a forecasted production quantity, that variable overhead is allocated to the forecasted production quantity. So it becomes a per unit overhead rate. So maybe an example would make it more clear. As we're going still with the Rubik's Cube example. So as previously stated, it takes 5 minutes to manufacture each Rubik's Cube. So 5 minutes to manufacture a Rubik's Cube. That means that's the first hint that we are going with the standard quantity of labor hours. The standard cost for indirect materials and maintenance for machining plastic pieces is 78 cents per hour. What is the standard variable overhead cost for one Rubik's Cube? And you can see the equation up at the top. It's also on this page. So we use standard labor hours in the problem. 5 minutes per unit translates to 0.083 hours per unit. And then we have our overhead variable rate of 78 cents per hour. And that was given in the problem. And again, that's determined by the budget at the beginning of the year. So the standard variable overhead cost is just multiplying those two numbers together, and it's about 7 cents per unit. Next is the fixed overhead costs. So these are the costs incurred by the entire production process. This is usually, again, a value that's calculated or set at the beginning of the year, and it's based on the budget. And it's also based off the same standard unit as is used by variable overhead cost. So some examples of fixed overhead costs include depreciation of machinery, property taxes, insurance, license fees, indirect labor from management. The way that fixed overhead costs is calculated is by taking the fixed overhead from the budget at the beginning of the year, total expected fixed overhead costs, and adjusting it by the total standard unit of measurement. So fixed overhead cost is unique in that it takes more of a total approach. It's more whole, I guess, more broad. So it takes the total standard unit of measurement, and as I said, it should be the same standard unit of measurement as a variable overhead. So here's our Rubik's Cube problem for fixed overhead cost. The standard time to produce one Rubik's Cube is 5 minutes. The production manager believes that next year's fixed overhead cost will be $97,000 and that the facility will produce 1 million units. There are two problems here. The first is A, what is the standard fixed overhead cost per direct labor hour? And the second is what is the standard fixed overhead cost per Rubik's Cube? You can see the equation at the top, and basically what that equation does is takes the total sum of the overhead fixed costs that is allocated by the budget and distributes it by all of the standard quantity labor hours that we are forecasting for the year. So we want every unit to be able to see some of that fixed overhead cost so that no one unit is seeing too much of the cost. So for part A, we again use standard labor hours because that's what we use in variable cost. So we can go back to our SQL, which is 0.083. We then, in order to get the total labor quantity, we multiply by 1 million units, which gives us 83,000 labor hours in the year. We have an overhead fixed cost of $97,000. And as I said, we want to break up that $97,000 to every one of those 83,000 labor hours. So the 97,000 is divided by the 83,000, and that gives $1.17 per labor hour. For part B, we are trying to determine the fixed overhead cost per Rubik's Cube. So we use the standard quantity of labor that we've been seeing throughout this process and the standard price for labor that we saw in part A and multiply those together, and that gives $0.097 per unit. If you look at that number, you can probably tell that we can also have taken the fixed overhead rate of $97,000 and just divided that by the 1,000 units produced to get the same number, and that's true. We could have done that. So here's your try-it-yourself problem for overhead cost. So for the spooning company, the total fixed cost for the quarter is $11,000, which includes rent, insurance, utilities, etc. Fixed cost is allocated on a per unit basis, assuming that production amount is 4,000 units. Variable costs are assigned on a per labor hour basis at a rate that was determined by the overhead budget. This rate is $15 per hour. Part A is to calculate the fixed overhead rate per unit, and Part B is to calculate the variable overhead rate per unit using standard quantity of labor of 0.016 hours per unit. And that's a number that you probably should have gotten in one of the other problems, but I wanted to supply it again just in case. Go ahead and pause the video and you can complete the problem. So in order to find the total standard cost, we essentially just sum up each of the standard costs that we found so far: the material, labor, variable overhead, and fixed overhead costs. That gives us $1.04 per unit. Our yearly total standard cost is then the total standard cost per 1 unit multiplied by the units forecasted to be produced in the year. And that gives us $1 million and some change. You can take a look at the profit and loss statement here. Hypothetically, if Hasbro sells Rubik's Cubes for $7 a piece, and in the first quarter 250,000 units were produced and sold, then the pro forma P&L would look like what's below. Pro forma means essentially at the beginning of the quarter. So before we really know what we've sold, we're projecting that this is what our P&L is going to look like. So we have our Rubik's Cube revenue of $1.75 million. Our standard costs are estimated cost of goods sold, and that's the standard cost per unit times the 250,000 units. And that gives a gross margin of about 85%. I left room for variances, cost variances, though we don't have any actual data yet, so we can't calculate cost variances. That will happen in the next series of videos, and we'll be able to fill in those columns or those rows. So just to sum it all up, standard costs are predicted costs for 1 unit of product. They include labor, material, variable, and fixed overhead. And the standard cost is the total standard cost is the sum of all standard costs to create an expected cost per product for a future period of time.